In these days, between the death of Pope Francis and the conclave to select a new pope that begins on Wednesday, I thought this Sunday would be a good moment to honor his memory, to reflect on his life, and to consider what legacies he might have left for Unitarian Universalists. Francis was a powerful liberalizing force in the Catholic Church, so there is much to appreciate. And for all his efforts during the 12 years of his papacy, in some ways, little movement actually happened. He prioritized church unity over transformations that were controversial. Instead of big changes, he planted far more seeds that have yet to germinate and grow. So let us start with broad areas of agreement with and affirmation of our Unitarian Universalist values. Pope Francis was the first, and perhaps maybe will be the only, Jesuit pope. He brought an inward ethic to the Catholic Church's spiritual discipline. He was far less attached to church doctrine and paid more attention to what God is calling people to do in this moment in time. To respond to that call requires flexibility and adaptability that attachment to doctrines does not. Francis was the first pope to be passionately dedicated to environmental justice. His 2016 encyclical Laudato Si presented a comprehensive vision of environmental stewardship that connected ecological concerns with social justice. He framed environmental concerns not as separate from one's spiritual life, but as central to it. He presented care for the earth as a religious calling rather than merely a political position. In 2019, he went further to call ecocide a sin. And more recently, in his 2023 encyclical Laudate Deum, pushed for immediate action to slow climate change and condemned climate change denial. There were Catholic churches around the world who are working on this. And Fourth Universalist is exploring a partnership with one here in New York City, St. Francis Xavier, a Jesuit parish. We both have worked with an organization Beyond Plastics and advocated in Albany at different times with them. This is an area where we can enthusiastically work together with Catholics in partnership for the good of the planet. Pope Francis made big framing strides for Catholics to change attitudes about LGBTQIA+ concerns, starting with his early comment, "Who am I to judge?" He supported civil unions as offering legal protection for couples and permitted the blessing of same-sex marriages. He permitted transgender people to be baptized. These are small steps, but they are moving in a direction Unitarian Universalists want. We can certainly celebrate his inclusion of women in leadership positions in the Vatican. He permitted women to vote with bishops at their meetings. He also believed there should be no impediment or reason to prevent women from assuming leadership roles. The same with lay participation in church governance. These are all movements Unitarian Universalists can affirm. The relationship between the Catholic Church and other faiths and faith traditions, Pope Francis prioritized ecumenical interfaith dialogue. He met with leaders from many religious traditions and emphasized common ground. In 2019, he went as far as to say pluralism and the diversity of religions, sex, race, language are willed by God in God's wisdom. This is a very meaningful affirmation from one of the dominant religions in the world, offering others a level of tolerance, even a level of acceptance. Where Pope Francis stretches and stimulated our growth and development was centering the poor, the marginalized, the refugee, and the immigrant. This wasn't one issue among many for this Pope. It was the core of his ministry he felt called to do in this world. We could do well to heed that passion. The background for that passion comes from a variation on liberation theology. Liberation theology arose in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s in Central and South America, inspired by the Second Vatican Council and responding to extreme inequality, military dictatorships, and civil wars. In Central America, it developed through base communities where the poor studied scripture together in small groups and recognized Jesus' ministry to and for them. It gained prominence through figures like Archbishop Oscar Romero in El Salvador, who was assassinated in 1980 while celebrating Mass. It centers and interprets Christianity through the direct experiences of the poor and oppressed. Salvation isn't limited to what happens after death. Salvation is liberation from economic and political oppression in this world. It prioritizes action in this world over abstract theology. It uses Marxist analysis tools to understand social structures and institutions that enforce poverty and oppression. A key component of liberation theology is the preferential option for the poor. God, as witnessed in Jesus' ministry, has a special concern for those who are marginalized, vulnerable, and suffering. Christians must prioritize the perspectives, needs, and liberation of the poor in all aspects of religious and social life. The church must actively side with the poor in their struggle against unjust economic and political structures. God's realm that Jesus proclaimed is characterized by justice and equity. The church must understand reality from the perspective of the poor, recognize the economic and political systems that create and maintain poverty, maintain solidarity with poor communities in their struggle, direct resources to these communities, and work in the political realm for structural change that will benefit the oppressed. While Francis embraced much of liberation theology, he wasn't a Marxist, though he appreciated the suffering that moved people to it as a solution for their suffering. His connection was a South American movement called the theology of the people. The theology of the people developed as a distinctly Argentine response to the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. It focused on direct personal experiences of meeting, praying, breaking bread with the poor, rather than studying concepts about God that lacked relevance and transcendence. It appreciated the popular spirituality, the people's mysticism, the way poor people live their religion, their everyday experiences of Christian faith. Rather than top-down authoritarian religion, it centers on the faith and culture of ordinary people, el pueblo, particularly the poor, as legitimate expressions of authentic Christian life and theological insight. This theology of the people focuses on culture rather than liberation theology's focus on class struggle as the primary lens for social analysis. It values popular religious expressions, processions, pilgrimages, devotions, as authentic manifestations of faith, not merely as superstition or religious ignorance. The preferential option for the poor is still there, as in liberation theology. But rather than a focus on economic liberation, it focuses on the cultural dignity and respect for the poor's own religious expressions. That is what is prioritized. Rather than the role of the priest as the enforcer of universal doctrine and the suppressor of cultural variation, it emphasizes the importance of pastors being close to the people, accompanying them in their daily reality. The challenge of Pope Francis's theology of the people is its intimacy with the people at the bottom of the religious hierarchy. This isn't how institutions like to work. They want to control from the top and extract from the bottom. I sense, too, a tension in Unitarian Universalism. The history of Fourth Universalist has been strong pulpit presence and wealthy backers in the pews in the 19th century. Their social services that they offered, wonderful as they were top-down, not bottom-up. The history of Unitarians from Boston were the elite of society, the Boston Brahmins, they were called. Historical Unitarianism is quite patriarchal, even in the time up to merger between the Unitarians and the Universalists in the 1950s and 60s. While we have a tradition of independent congregations ruled by the members, there's always been tension between the learned clergy and their dominance with great ideas from their scholarship. They have consistently resisted over time bottom-up movements from the pews. The Black empowerment controversy of the 1960s, anti-racism, anti-oppression, multiculturalism efforts driven from the top during the 1990s and 2000s haven't gained the wide acceptance among our membership, especially when it started talking about white supremacy culture, microaggressions, and reparations. These haven't come up from the bottom as they have with the Latin and Southern American Catholic Church from their deep connection to indigenous communities. Our members are typically well-educated professional class people, the ones who are enjoying the fruits of exploitation of those base communities from the Southern Hemisphere who feed us, mine minerals, and drill fossil fuels for us, and provide the fiber we need for our clothes and our homes. Here are some ways Pope Francis engaged the base communities that could be quite helpful inspirations for Unitarian Universalists who are attracted to the theology of the people movement. He explicitly linked ecological degradation to social inequality. He emphasized the environmental problems could be linked to environmental racism and injustice. Unitarian Universalists could build on that linkage to partner with frontline communities most affected by pollution and climate impacts. In our justice work with the environment, we can incorporate our other justice work, like disability justice, economic justice, and racial justice. To be the most helpful, we need to be connected and accountable to those who are suffering. Francis succeeded in translating complex environmental science into moral language that resonated with ordinary people. Unitarian Universalists can incorporate these perspectives as we develop accessible educational materials about climate science that connect to UU values. We can use storytelling and visual arts to help congregations understand environmental impacts. We can create intergenerational programming that engages all ages in environmental learning. Francis incorporated perspectives from indigenous communities in his environmental teachings and has been a vocal supporter of indigenous land rights. We can also acknowledge the indigenous lands, as we do at the beginning of our service, our congregations occupy and build relationships with local tribes. We can incorporate indigenous ecological wisdom into religious education with appropriate attribution. We can also support indigenous-led environmental movements and sovereignty struggles here in New York City. In our worship, we can also be inspired by Pope Francis. Maybe not theology, where we do not have agreement, but in the process of worship. Francis's communication style acknowledges everyday realities and concerns rather than speaking from a detached ideological perspective. Francis frequently grounded his teachings in personal anecdotes or stories of individuals that he encountered. Francis frequently used vivid metaphors to make abstract concepts tangible. He described the church as a field hospital after battle, to emphasize prioritizing healing over judgment. He called priests to be, I love this expression, priests to be shepherds living with the smell of the sheep, rather than detached administrators. He warned against Christians becoming sourpusses or having funeral faces when they become too rigid or judgmental. These images stick in people's minds and communicate complex theological positions in ways that connect emotionally, not just intellectually. Francis consistently centered the experiences of the poor and marginalized. This parallels our effort to center the voices of the marginalized in our congregations. If we care about affirming and supporting diversity in our congregations, we must examine who gets the most influential speaking roles and leadership positions. We have to be intentional about prioritizing the needs of those most often overlooked. We must develop leadership pathways for youth, for BIPOC members, and for those with disabilities. It would be easy for Unitarian Universalists to be critical of a leader of a religious tradition we have dissented from since the Reformation. We do not agree in profound ways about theology, women's reproductive rights, and religious hierarchy. What we can deeply appreciate about Pope Francis is the way he was willing to build bridges with non-Catholic religious traditions and bring a reforming lens to his own. May we take inspiration this morning from his life and teachings that can help us evolve Unitarian Universalism to better serve our members, those attracted to our way of doing religion, and to better serve human society and the protection and preservation of our planet. So be it.